I stood frozen at my own dining table, my hand still holding the serving spoon. David's mother sat across from me, her fork paused mid-air. His teenage daughter looked confused. But David, my husband of 5 years, stared straight ahead at the tablet propped against the fruit bowl, where Sandra's face filled the screen. His ex-wife, the woman who had smirked at the back of our church during our wedding day. "I can't do without her," David said, his voice steady and clear. The words hung in the air like a curse. My chest tightened. I looked at Sandra on the screen. She was smiling, that cruel, knowing smile I remembered from years ago. "Told you, darling," she purred into the phone. "No one loves you like I do." His mother sighed, not shocked but like she'd known this moment was coming all along. My hand trembled so badly I dropped the spoon. It clattered against the ceramic plate, the sound too loud in the sudden quiet. I realized in that terrible moment that I'd been living a lie for 5 entire years. Not because my husband had cheated, but because his heart had never actually left his first wife. My name is Emma Cole. 5 years ago, I thought I was marrying my best friend. That's what David told me when we started dating. He said Sandra was ancient history, a mistake from his youth that he'd learned from. He promised me she meant nothing anymore. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because I loved him. I remember our wedding day like it was yesterday. I wore my mother's pearl necklace and a white dress I'd saved for months to buy. David looked so handsome in his gray suit. But I also remember seeing Sandra in the back row, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite name. It looked like ownership. After the ceremony, people whispered to me, "You'll never replace her, you know." I'd laughed it off then, thinking they were just being mean. Now I understood they were telling me the truth. Turns out, I whispered to my reflection that night after everything had fallen apart, they were right about that. After that dinner, I started paying attention to things I'd ignored before. Sandra's name never actually left our house. David's mother, Patricia, still called her regularly, always talking about their daughter, even though Sandra had lost custody years ago. Sandra still texted David constantly, always about co-parenting, though half the time it was just random photos she'd taken or thought she wanted to share. Even our dog, Max, responded more eagerly to Sandra's name than to mine. It sounds silly, but it broke something inside me. I started to feel like a tenant in someone else's story, a temporary fill-in while everyone waited for the real leading lady to return. The worst part wasn't the jealousy, it was the erasure. I was there but invisible, present but powerless. One Tuesday afternoon I was putting away David's laundry when I found it, a birthday card in his briefcase, tucked beneath some work papers. The handwriting was elegant and familiar. It was from Sandra. Forever S. The signature read. My hand shook as I held it. Forever? We were in the middle of our marriage, and she was still signing cards to him with promises of forever. I copied the card and put it back exactly where I found it. Then I started keeping a journal. Just small observations. Just facts. I told myself that one day they would all see the truth. When I confronted David about Sandra's visits, his response was always the same. "You're being paranoid, Emma. She's just co-parenting. You're paranoid." He'd hug me then too tightly like he was trying to squeeze out my doubts. His mother backed him up completely. "Sandra is part of this family, dear. You need to accept it," she'd say, her voice dripping with sympathy, as if I was the unreasonable one for not wanting my husband's ex-wife constantly around. I started keeping detailed notes in a hidden notebook. Every late-night call. Every message. Every way they gaslit me into believing I was the problem. But I stopped arguing about it. I stopped crying in the bathroom. Instead I started watching. Watching patterns. Watching behaviors. Watching lies get stacked on top of other lies until the foundation of my marriage looked completely rotten. One night, alone in bed after another fight, I whispered to myself in the mirror, "If they want me weak, they're going to regret it." I didn't know exactly what I'd do yet, but I knew I couldn't stay like this forever. Something inside me was waking up. Something angry. Something strategic. Sandra started appearing at our house unannounced. She'd text David moments before arriving, always with some excuse. She needed to drop off something for his daughter, or she wanted to pick up a photo she'd left behind years ago. David never turned her away. He'd open the door like she was a guest, not an intruder. I'd watch from the kitchen as they sat on the couch, their conversations flowing so naturally, so intimately, like no time had passed at all. During one family dinner, Sandra showed up with wine and laughed her way through the entire meal. David finished her sentences. He leaned toward her when she spoke. He smiled at her jokes in a way he hadn't smiled at anything I'd said in months. I sat at the head of the table, the position I'd earned by being his wife, but I felt invisible. That's when I truly understood. I wasn't his wife. I was his cover story. When Sandra raised her glass that night and toasted, "To David, the only man who ever truly loved me," nobody corrected her. Not David. Not his mother. Not his daughter. They all just raised their glasses. I set mine down quietly and excused myself to get dessert. In the kitchen, I took deep breaths and made a decision. I was done trying to fight this. I was going to watch it all burn instead. I stopped confronting them. I stopped crying. I stopped explaining myself. Instead, I watched. I noticed everything. The pattern of Sandra's visits always happened when David was stressed about work. His mother would call Sandra before calling me, even though I was the one actually living with him. His teenage daughter Lily would leave notes from Sandra on her pillow. Little encouragement that made her feel special. I realized they'd built an entire network of loyalty around Sandra, and I'd been trying to break it by fighting it. That was their game. So I decided to change the rules. I'd gather information. I'd prepare. I'd make sure that when the moment came, I'd have facts, not just feelings. If they want to keep playing this game, I whispered to myself, examining the house differently now, I'll learn the rules better than they have. One afternoon, I followed Patricia to a coffee shop downtown. I sat at a corner table, hidden behind a newspaper, and watched. Patricia met Sandra there. They didn't notice me. I watched them laugh like old friends plotting something. Watched Patricia reach across the table and squeeze Sandra's hand. Watched Sandra lean in and whisper something that made Patricia laugh even harder. They weren't being careful because they didn't think they had to be. Nobody was watching them. Nobody challenged them anymore. I quietly took out my phone and recorded a short video clip. Nothing obvious, just them sitting together. Their body language saying everything. I saved it in a private folder. That's when the real understanding hit me like a wave. They never let me in because they never wanted me there. I wasn't failing as a wife. I was failing as a stand-in. And they were never going to treat me differently because they didn't see me as the real thing. David's daughter Lily slipped up one day when we were arguing about laundry. She was frustrated with me for asking her to fold her own clothes, and she snapped, "Dad said you'll never be like Mom anyway." She froze immediately, realizing what she'd said. But it was too late. The words hung there, honest and terrible. Later that evening, I overheard her on the phone with her mother. "Yeah, Dad's still the same. Sandra says the house was never even supposed to be Emma's anyway." My stomach dropped. The house? I excused myself and went to check the property deed. My hands were shaking as I searched through the filing cabinet in David's office. There it was. The deed to our home. Co-owned by David and Sandra. My name wasn't on it at all. I sat down on the floor and couldn't move for an hour. This wasn't just emotional betrayal anymore. This was legal. Financial. This was real property that I'd helped maintain, helped pay for with my own money, and I had no claim to at all. When I finally asked David about it, he barely looked up from his phone. "I just forgot to add you," he said casually, like he'd forgotten to pick up milk at the store. The betrayal was stunning in its coldness. I asked him why Sandra's name was still on it if they were divorced, and he got defensive. "It's complicated," he said. "We co-own it because of tax stuff. It doesn't really matter, Emma. You live here. Isn't that enough? Wasn't that enough?" Those words stayed with me all night. No, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. My marriage wasn't enough. My love wasn't enough. Because I had a competitor for my husband's heart, and she had legal documents to prove she'd always come first. That night, I silently copied every property document. I photographed every deed, every tax form, every official record that showed the house belonged to David and Sandra, not to me. I saved it all in a password-protected folder on my computer. I was finally starting to understand something dangerous. I was beginning to see how to fight back. A few weeks later, an anonymous message came through on Instagram from someone who said they worked with David. "Sandra's been visiting him at work. the message said. Visiting him during lunch. Just wanted you to know. My first instinct was to feel that familiar stab of jealousy and pain, but I didn't let myself feel it. Instead, I added this information to my mental map of his lies. The puzzle pieces were connecting now. The late nights working late were sometimes actually visits with Sandra. The business trips were sometimes detours. The constant phone calls made sense now. David wasn't just emotionally unavailable to me. He was actively maintaining a relationship with his ex-wife while being married to me. The evidence was mounting. But I didn't explode. I didn't confront him. I started smiling again, and David mistook it for forgiveness. What he didn't realize was that it was something much more dangerous. It was a strategy. I spent the next several weeks playing the perfect wife. I was quiet, warm, and supportive. I cooked his favorite meals. I listened to his work problems with genuine interest. I even invited Lily to go shopping with me, and asked her to help me plan a surprise dinner for David. Everyone relaxed. Patricia stopped calling as often to check on David. Sandra's visits became less frequent because David seemed happy. They all thought I'd finally accepted my place and stopped making waves. But while I was playing the perfect wife, I was also gathering passwords, email addresses, login credentials that David had carelessly left written down, contact information, receipts. I was building a case so solid that nobody could deny the truth anymore. Then I found it. An email chain marked our house. The subject line made my blood run cold. I opened it with shaking hands. The emails were between David and Sandra, and they painted a picture of betrayal so complete that I had to sit down to breathe. They were planning to refinance their home behind my back. They were discussing taking out a loan against the house, a house I'd paid for, a house I lived in, a house I thought would be my security. Sandra's tone was flirty and possessive. We could use the money to finally get away together, she'd written. Just us, the way we planned before you made that marriage mistake. A marriage mistake. That's what I was. That's what our 5 years together meant to him. I printed everything. Every email. Every plan. Every revelation of how little regard they had for me and my future. That night I whispered to myself in the bathroom mirror. This isn't heartbreak anymore. This is a strategy. And I'm winning now. I took time off work and met with a lawyer in a coffee shop across town where nobody would recognize me. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Janet, listened to my story without judgment. She reviewed the documents I'd brought. You have a strong case, she told me. Don't confront him. Build your case further. Document everything. When you leave, you'll be leaving on your terms with all the power. Janet advised me to open a separate bank account and start moving small amounts of money into it. She showed me how to secure my important documents. She explained my legal rights regarding the house, the savings, everything. I felt something shift inside me during that meeting. It wasn't hope. It was something colder and more powerful. It was the understanding that I could take control of my own future. A few days later, I discovered something else. David had moved a large sum of money into what he called a joint fund with Sandra. Over $50,000. Supposedly this was for their daughter's education, but the timing was suspicious. Right after their recent conversations about getting a loan, I took screenshots of everything and added it to my folder. I created a hidden folder on my laptop, buried deep where David would never think to look. I titled it simply, Evidence. Inside were photographs of property deeds, screenshots of emails, copied bank statements, recordings of conversations I'd overheard. Late at night, when David was asleep, I'd sit in the darkness and review everything. They built a web of lies, I whispered to myself. But I'm learning to weave something stronger. I thought about everything they'd done. Every time they'd make me feel crazy for being upset. Every time they'd gaslit me into thinking I was the problem. Every time they'd chosen each other over me and called it family loyalty. My anger wasn't hot and explosive anymore. It was cold and focused. It was the anger of someone who finally understood exactly what needed to happen. I planned a special dinner for David's birthday. I invited Patricia. I invited Lily. I made his favorite foods. Everything was perfect on the surface. Then, just as we were finishing the main course, my phone accidentally rang. It was Sandra. I apologized and said I had to take it in the other room, but really I was setting the stage. I told Sandra to video call instead. When she did, I accidentally left the tablet sitting on the table where David's mother could see it. Then I came back and suggested we do a slideshow I'd made as a birthday surprise. Everyone gathered around. The first few photos were normal, David and me at the beach, David with his friends, David and Lily at her school event. But then came the final images. Screenshots of the emails between David and Sandra about refinancing the house. The bank statement showing the $50,000. The deed with only David and Sandra's names. Silence filled the room. David's mother actually fainted. She just slipped out of her chair onto the floor. David's face went from confused to red to absolutely furious. "You vindictive bitch!" he shouted, standing up so fast his chair fell backward. Sandra, still visible on the tablet screen, gasped and started yelling his name. Lily began to cry. Patricia was still on the floor. I remained completely calm. "I'm done," I said quietly. "I'm done arguing for a seat at a table that was never mine. I'm done being invisible in my own marriage. I'm done." I stood up, collected my bag and looked David in the eyes. "You said you couldn't do without her. Let's see how that works out for you now that she knows you were planning to use her money to refinance a house you never told her about. Let's see what she thinks about that." He grabbed my arm but I pulled away. I walked out of that house and didn't look back. I spent that first night alone in a hotel, crying and laughing at the same time. The crying was for the marriage I'd lost, for the 5 years I'd wasted, for the person I used to be before all of this. The laughing was because I was finally free. Finally I could breathe. Finally I wasn't pretending anymore. The next day I went back to the house while David wasn't home. I took only what I'd bought, my clothes, my books, my laptop, my jewelry, my grandmother's quilt. I left everything else exactly where it was. I took a final photo of myself in the entryway, standing alone in that empty feeling space that had never really been mine. "You said you can't live without her," I whispered to the empty house. "Let's both find out if that's true." When David's mother called threatening to ruin my name in the community, I didn't panic or argue. Instead, I calmly sent her the entire evidence file. Every screenshot, every document, every piece of proof about what David and Sandra had been planning. Within hours, she deleted her social media accounts. She stopped talking to me, but she also stopped talking to David. The war turned silent, which was somehow worse for him than if it had been loud. Sandra called me directly for the first time in years, panicked and furious. "Did you tell him to leave me alone?" she demanded. I smiled into the phone. "No," I said calmly. "I just let the truth out. Apparently David's been using you too. For money. Financially." She hung up without another word. But I could picture her finally understanding what I'd learned 5 years ago. David wasn't capable of real love. He was only capable of using people. David's job found out about his financial cover-up. I didn't tell them, but someone did. Maybe it was Sandra. Maybe it was Patricia taking revenge. I never found out, but it didn't matter. He was suspended from work pending an investigation. The perfect image he'd spent so long building began to crack. People in the community started asking questions. The family he'd been so proud of started falling apart. The divorce was finalized quietly on a gray Tuesday afternoon. I wore a beige suit and walked into the courthouse alone. I walked out alone. There was no confrontation in front of the judge because David didn't even show up. His lawyer handled it for him. I'd gotten the house. Finally, my name was on the deed. I'd gotten a settlement. I'd gotten my freedom. I signed the final papers and looked at my signature on the divorce decree. It was official. 5 years of my life had just been legally erased. But I wasn't sad about it. I was relieved. I wanted closure. I told myself as I walked to my car. But peace feels so much better. Sandra posted cryptic things on social media for a few weeks. Some people never appreciate loyalty. Betrayal comes in many forms. Turns out, the person you trust most can hurt you the most. The posts got fewer and fewer. Then they stopped entirely. Rumors started circulating in the community. David had been trying to get back with me. He'd supposedly written me long letters which I never opened. He'd supposedly shown up at my new apartment, which I was never there to see. I ignored everything. The irony was beautiful and terrible. The man who'd chosen his ex-wife over me now was desperately trying to get back with me. But I wasn't interested in broken people anymore. I was interested in building something real. I used a small inheritance my parents had left me to open my own interior design studio. I called it New Beginnings Design. My first client was a woman who'd recently come out of a bad divorce. As I helped her transform her space, she told me her story. The betrayal, the loneliness, the slow realization that she'd been invisible in her own life. I listened and understood. And I realized something powerful. My pain had given me purpose. Every woman who walked into my studio came with a story like mine or worse. And I could help them see that their space could be theirs. Their home could be theirs. Their lives could be theirs. My marriage may have been a lie, but this was something real. Months passed. David and Sandra tried to rekindle their relationship. I heard through mutual acquaintances that it imploded almost immediately, destroyed by jealousy and blame and financial disputes. His mother turned on Sandra completely, calling her the ruin of our family. Patricia started coming into my studio, pretending not to recognize me at first, then apologizing quietly for how she treated me. I accepted her apology but didn't let her back into my life. Some relationships, once broken, shouldn't be fixed. My name, which had once been whispered about with pity and judgment, started to be spoken with respect. Women wanted my design advice. People asked me how I'd rebuilt so quickly. I became someone people looked up to instead of someone they pitied. I signed the lease for my new studio apartment on a bright morning with sun pouring through the windows. It was mine, the lease, the decorations, everything. The apartment had exposed brick walls and tall windows that looked out over the city. I stood in the center of the empty space and smiled at my reflection in the glass. He said he couldn't do without her. I said aloud to nobody in particular. Maybe that was true. But I learned to live beautifully without them. All of them. I turned away from the window and didn't look back. My new life was waiting.